They said no woman ever walked out before sunrise, but they never said what happened when one refused to break. The elevator climbed in silence, each floor lighting up like a countdown. I couldn't stop. And somewhere between the 47th and the penthouse, I realized my hands weren't shaking, not even a little, which should have scared me more than anything else, because every story I'd heard about the Voss twins ended the same way. With silence, with disappearance, with people pretending they had never existed at all. And yet here I was, standing alone in a mirrored box worth more than my entire apartment. Building, watching my reflection stare back at me like it already knew something I didn't, like it understood this night wasn't going to follow the rules everyone else had written for it. And maybe that's why I stepped forward when the doors opened instead of hesitating, instead of turning around, instead of running like every instinct I'd ever had told me to do. Because the truth is I didn't come here by accident, and I didn't come here unprepared. I came here knowing exactly whose territory I was walking into, knowing exactly what kind of men waited behind those doors. Men who owned more than businesses, more than streets, more than entire sections of the city that moved at their command. Men who didn't need to raise their voices to be heard because power like theirs didn't shout, it whispered, and everyone listened anyway. The hallway stretched in front of me like something out of a dream, all glass and dark marble and quiet, so complete it felt engineered, like even sound needed. Permission to exist here. And then I saw them, not all at once, not dramatically, just two figures at the far end of the room, identical in the way that made your brain pause for half a second too long. Both tall, both still, both watching me like I was something they hadn't decided how to categorize yet. Adrian stood slightly to the left, his posture relaxed in a way that wasn't casual at all, while Victor leaned against the edge of the bar, one hand resting near a glass he hadn't touched. And neither of them spoke at first, which somehow made everything louder, my heartbeat, the quiet hum of the city 50 floors below, the sound of my own breathing that. I forced to stay steady, because I knew this part mattered. The first few seconds always mattered. The moment where they expected fear, expected hesitation, expected me to fold into whatever role they had already assigned me before I even stepped through the door. But I didn't. I just stood there and met their gaze, and something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but real enough that I saw it flicker across Adrian's eyes before it disappeared again. "You're earlier than expected," Victor said. Finally, his voice smooth, controlled, like this was just another night in a long line of nights that all blurred together. And maybe for him, it was maybe every woman before me had walked into this room carrying the same tension, the same fear, the same silent understanding of how this would end. But I wasn't them. And they felt it, I could tell, not because they said anything, but because neither of them looked away, not even for a second. And when I took a step forward, just one, deliberate and unhurried, the distance between us didn't feel like something they controlled anymore. It felt like something I was choosing to cross. "I don't think I am," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. And that's when it happened. Not a dramatic reaction, not a visible change, just the smallest pause. The kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, but I was, and I saw it. I saw the moment the script they were used to stopped working, the moment expectation cracked just enough to let something else in, something unpredictable, something they couldn't measure or contain. And for the first time, I realized the stories were wrong. Not because they exaggerated who the Voss twins were, but because they underestimated what would happen when someone walked in without fear, because fear was their language and I didn't speak it. And standing there under the soft glow of a city that belonged to them, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. I expected them to move first, to close the distance, to reassert whatever invisible control they were used to holding over every room they entered. But they did not. And that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like a test I had already passed without realizing it. Victor's fingers tapped once against the side of his glass before going still again. A small motion, but deliberate, calculated, the kind of detail you only noticed when everything else refused to move, while Adrian's gaze never left mine. Not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into his world. "Do you know where you are?" Victor asked, his tone shifting slightly, not louder, not harsher, just edged with something that suggested this was the part where people usually corrected themselves, where they remembered fear and adjusted accordingly. But I did not answer right away. Not because I did not know, but because I wanted them to sit in that question for a second longer, to feel what it was like when control did not immediately return to them on command. And when I finally spoke, I did not look away. Yes, I said simply, and that single word seemed to land heavier than anything else I could have added, because it carried no hesitation, no apology, no uncertainty, just acknowledgement, and something else beneath it, something they were not used to hearing. Victor's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, more like recognition of a pattern breaking in real time. Most people pretend they do not, he said, setting the glass down without taking a sip, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet space. It makes it easier for them. Easier for what? I asked, taking another step forward, close enough now that I could see the faint line of tension in his jaw, the kind that came from holding back more than from letting go. And for the first time, Adrian shifted, not much, just enough to straighten slightly, as if my movement had pulled something in him forward that he had not intended to reveal. To believe they have a choice, Adrian said, and his voice was different from his brother's, lower, steadier, not colder, but more control like he chose. Each word instead of letting them fall into place, and I felt it then, the subtle fracture between them, not conflict, not yet, but difference, the kind that could grow into something larger if given the right pressure. And do I asked, not challenging, not defiant, just curious in a way that made the question feel real instead of rhetorical. And that was when Victor laughed, soft and brief, like he had heard this conversation too many times before to be surprised by it. No, he said, direct, unfiltered, the answer he was used to giving without consequence. But Adrian did not echo him, did not confirm it, did not deny it either. He just watched me. And in that silence, I understood something important, something the stories never mentioned. They were not identical in the ways that mattered. And that difference was not a weakness, not yet. But it was something I could use, something I could push. Then why am I here, I asked. And this time I let a hint of something enter my voice, not fear, not submission, but intention, because that was the truth they were not expecting. I had not come here to survive. I had come here for a reason, and Victor's expression sharpened slightly, like he was recalculating, adjusting the narrative he had already written in his head. Because you were brought here, he said, as if that explained everything, as if that was enough. But I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. No, I said, and that word carried more weight than before, because this time it contradicted him, directly, without hesitation. I am here because I chose to be, and that was the moment everything changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way the air shifted, in the way Victor's fingers stilled completely, in the way Adrian's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because choice was not something they were used to hearing in this room, not from someone standing where I was standing, and I saw it then, clear as anything, the first real crack in the control they thought they had. And for the first time since I stepped off that elevator, I knew I had their attention, not as a target, not as a passing distraction, but as something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, something they could not predict. And as the city lights flickered behind them like a silent witness, I realized this was no longer their game alone. Victor was the first to move, not toward me, but around me, slow and deliberate, like he was circling a question instead of a person, and I led him. I did not turn to follow him, did not break my stance, because I knew this was another test, another moment where most people would adjust themselves to match his movement, to prove they understood the unspoken rules of his space. But I was not here to follow. I was here to shift the direction entirely. Choice, he repeated quietly, as if the word itself was unfamiliar in this room, like it did not belong among the glass and steel and silence that surrounded us. And when he stopped just behind me, close enough that I could feel the presence of him without him ever touching me, I still did not turn. I kept my eyes on Adrian, because that was where the real answer was forming, not in Victor's calculated movements, but in the way Adrian had gone completely still, like he was listening for something deeper than words. People do not choose us, Victor continued, his voice now just over my shoulder, controlled, measured, but edged with something sharper beneath it. They end up here, and for a second, The room seemed to agree with him, the walls, the height, the distance from the world below. Everything about this place felt like something you were brought into, not something you walked into willingly, and maybe that had been true for everyone else, but not for me. I turned in, slowly, not reacting to him, but acknowledging him on my own terms, and when our eyes met, I saw it. Not anger, not yet, but disruption. That might be true for them. I said, my voice calm, steady, unshaken, but not for me, and this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, more focused, because now it was not just a break in their expectation, it was a direct contradiction to the reality they had built their control on. Adrian finally moved, just a step forward, but it changed the entire dynamic of the room, because now it was no longer Victor controlling the space alone, it was something shared, something shifting. Why? Adrian asked, and that single word carried more weight than everything Victor had said, because it was not a challenge, it was a genuine question, and that was dangerous in a place like this. Curiosity always was. I studied him for a second, really looked not at the surface, not at the suit, or the posture, or the authority that wrapped around him like a second skin, but at the stillness beneath it, the part of him that did not react the same way, the part that noticed instead of controlled. And I realized something then, something that made everything clearer. Because you're not what they think you are, I said. I did not raise my voice, did not soften it either. I just let the truth sit there between us. And that was when Victor reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but his expression hardened just enough to show it had landed. Careful, he said, stepping forward now, reclaiming the space he had momentarily given up. You are making assumptions, but I shook my head slightly, not dismissing him, just correcting him. No, I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am recognizing patterns, and that was the moment the balance tipped, subtle, almost invisible, but real enough that all three of us felt it, because now I was not reacting to them. I was reading them, and they knew it. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, deeper now, sharper, like he was trying to see how far this went, how much I actually understood. Then tell me, he said quietly, what do you see? And for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because this was not part of their script. This was not how these nights went. No one asked questions like that here. No one invited answers they could not control. And I could have stepped back then, could have softened it, could have played into the version of this story they were used to, but I did not come here to survive their version of the night. I came here to rewrite it. And as I looked at both of them, really looked, I let the answer form without hesitation. I see two men, I said slowly, who are used to being feared. I paused, just long enough to let that settle, just long enough for Victor's jaw to tighten slightly. And one of you, I continued, my eyes shifting back to. Adrian is tired of it. And that was it, the real break, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, because for the first time since I walked into that penthouse, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, I knew I had reached something neither of them expected me to find. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, tightened, like something fragile being pulled too far, and I could feel it in the air between us. The shift from control to uncertainty, subtle, but undeniable. Victor was the first to react, not with words, but with movement, a single step closer, enough to reassert his presence, enough to remind the room that he was not someone who allowed narratives to slip out of his hands. But even that felt different now, less automatic, more deliberate, like he was choosing each motion instead of relying on instinct. You think you understand us, he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that had not been there before, not anger, not yet, but resistance, like he was pushing back against something he did not want to acknowledge. I did not answer immediately, because this part mattered, the timing, the weight of the response, the way silence could say more than words if you let it sit long enough. And when I finally spoke, I did not soften it. No, I said, steady, calm. I think I see what you're trying not to show. And that landed differently. I could see it in the way his expression tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me because I was watching for it. Adrian had not moved, not physically, but something about him had shifted. The stillness in him was no longer neutral. It was focused now, like he was no longer observing me, but listening to himself through what I was saying. And that was the moment I had been waiting for, the point where this stopped being about them controlling me and started becoming about them confronting something they had kept buried. You should leave, Victor said, and this time the words were sharper, not loud, not forceful, but final in the way he intended them to be, like a door closing before anything else could get through. But I did not move, not even a fraction, because I knew that was not a command. Not really, it was a defense, and the difference mattered. If I was going to leave, I said quietly, I would not have come this far. And for the first time, Adrian's gaze shifted, not away, but deeper. Like he was searching for something specific in my face, something that would prove I was bluffing, that I was playing a role, that I was like everyone else who had stood where I was standing before, but he did not find it. And I knew he did not, because his expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, a subtle shift in his posture, the kind that meant something inside him had recognized the truth whether he wanted to or not. Why here? He asked again, softer this time, and that question carried more weight now, because it was no longer curiosity alone, it was something closer to need, and that was dangerous, not for me, but for them, because once that question existed, could not be undone. I exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but to steady the moment, to make sure what I said next landed exactly where it needed to, because this is the only place no one tells you the truth, I said, and I watched it hit, watched the way Victor's jaw tightened again, watched the way Adrian did not react outwardly at all, which somehow said more than anything else could have. People outside. I continued, my voice still even, still controlled. They either fear you or they need something from you. So they become whatever you expect them to be. I took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the point undeniable. But that is not real. And now I was close enough to see the smallest details, the tension in Victor's shoulders, the way Adrian's breathing had slowed instead of quickened, controlled instead of reactive. So you build a place like this, I said, glancing briefly around the penthouse before bringing my focus back to them, where no one questions you, where no one challenges you, where everything stays exactly the way you want it. I paused then, just long enough to let the weight of it settle, just long enough for them to feel what I was about to say before I said it. But that is not control. I finished quietly. That is isolation. And that was it. The word that shifted everything, because this time, neither of them could dismiss it. Neither of them could redirect it. It landed exactly where it was meant to, and in the silence that followed, heavier than anything before it, I saw it clearly, not just the crack now, but the space behind it, the part of them that no one had ever reached. And for the first time, I realized something even more important than anything I'd said so far. They were not dangerous because they were untouchable. They were dangerous because no one had ever dared to touch the truth in front of them. Until now. The word hung there longer than anything else had. Not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore. Isolation. It settled into the space like it belonged there, like it had always been there and no one had ever said it out loud. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Even the city outside seemed quieter, like it was waiting to see what they would do with it. Victor's expression did not break. Not completely, but I saw it, the smallest shift in his eyes, the kind that only happens when something lands too close to the truth. You are very confident, he said finally, and his voice was controlled again, but different, not dismissive anymore, not entirely, more careful now, like he was choosing his response instead of reacting to mine, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. I had crossed into something real. Adrian had not looked away once, and now there was something else in his gaze, not just focus, not just curiosity, but recognition, the kind that happens when someone hears something they have thought before, but never allowed themselves to say. Confidence is not the same as being wrong. I replied, my tone steady, not challenging him, just holding the ground I'd already taken, and for a second, it felt like the room shifted again, not physically, but in the way power moved between us, no longer one direction, no longer something that flowed only from them to me. It was shared now, unstable, unpredictable, and Victor felt it. I could see it in the way his shoulders squared slightly, in the way he stepped closer again, not circling this time, not observing, but confronting. You came here to prove something, he said. And this time it was not a question. It was an attempt to define me, to put me back into a shape he understood, because that was how control worked. You named something, and it became manageable, but I shook my head slowly, not rejecting him, just refusing the frame he was trying to place around me. I said, and I held his gaze without hesitation. I came here because no one else would say it to you, and that was when the tension sharpened. Not explosive, not chaotic, but focused like a line pulled too tight between 3 points. And for the first time, Adrian moved without hesitation, stepping forward until he was no longer behind. Victor, no longer observing from a distance, but standing beside him, equal, present. And that changed everything, because now it was not one voice against another. It was balance. It was difference. It was something that could shift in either direction. Say what? Adrian asked quietly, and his voice was softer than his brother's, but it carried further, not because it was louder, but because it mattered more in that moment. I looked at him, not Victor, because this answer was not for both of them. It was for the one who had already started listening. That you're not as in control as everyone thinks, I said, and I let the words sit there, unguarded, unsoftened, because truth did not need decoration. It only needed to be heard. Victor's jaw tightened again, but he did not interrupt, did not shut it down, which told me even more than if he had reacted, because silence meant consideration, even if he did not want it to. You control everything outside this room. I continued, my voice still calm, still even, but in here, you repeat the same pattern over and over, the same people, the same reactions, the same outcome. I took a small step forward, closing the space just enough to make the point undeniable. That is not power, I said, meeting Adrian's eyes directly. That is routine. And that word hit differently, sharper, more precise, because routine was predictable, and predictable was the one thing men like them could not afford to be. And I saw it then clearly. The way Adrian's expression shifted just slightly, not outwardly, but internally, like something had aligned in a way he could not ignore anymore, while Victor remained still, controlled, but no longer untouched. You think you're different, Victor said, his voice quieter now, more measured, and there was something in it that had not been there before, not doubt, but awareness. I know I am, I replied without hesitation, and that certainty was not loud, not aggressive. It was simple, grounded, unshaken, and that was what made it real, because I was not trying to convince them. I was stating something I had already accepted, and that was the moment the dynamic shifted again, deeper this time, not just a crack in their control, but a fracture in the structure beneath it, because now it was not just about what I was saying, it was about what they were starting to realize. And as the silence returned, heavier than before, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about surviving the night. This was about what would happen when it ended. And for the first time, I was not the one stepping into their world. They were the ones being pulled into mine. The shift did not snap. It settled, slow and heavy, like something inevitable finally finding its place. And for the first time since I stepped into that penthouse, the silence did not belong to them. It belonged to all of us, shared, uncertain, alive in a way it had not been before. Adrian did not move, but I could feel the change in him. Not in posture, not in expression, but in attention, sharper now, deeper. Like he was no longer measuring me, but measuring himself against what I had said. While Victor stood just slightly ahead, still holding the edge of control, but no longer untouched by what had been set in motion. Routine, Victor repeated quietly, as if testing the word, as if deciding whether to reject it or accept it. And that hesitation was everything, because hesitation meant possibility, and possibility meant loss of absolute control. You reduce everything to something simple, he added, but there was no dismissal in it now, no easy confidence, just calculation, and I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. No, I said, I make it clear, and that difference mattered. Clarity was harder to escape than complexity, because it left no place to hide. Adrian exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of movement from him that was not controlled, not planned, just real. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not authority, not command, but honesty. And what happens when the routine breaks? He asked, and that question shifted everything again, because now he was not defending the structure, he was questioning it. And that meant the foundation was no longer stable. I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment the night had been building toward, the point where control turned into choice. Then you have to decide who you are without it, I said, and I did not soften it, did not slow it down. I let it land exactly as it was, because that was the truth they had never been forced to face. Victor's expression hardened again, but this time it was not resistance, it was recognition, the kind that comes when something cannot be denied anymore, even if it is not accepted. We do not lose control, he said, but the certainty in his voice was thinner now, stretched, no longer absolute. And I did not argue. I did not challenge him directly. I simply stepped closer, just enough to stand between them, not dividing, not confronting, but existing in the space they had always owned. Alone, already have, I said quietly, and that was the moment everything stopped. Not just the movement, not just the tension, but the illusion itself, because now it was undeniable, not because I said it, but because they felt it. Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, like he was tracing something back, something that had been there long before I arrived. Something he had ignored because it had never been forced into the open, until now, and Victor did not speak, not immediately, which told me more than any response could have, because silence from someone like him was never empty. It was processing, it was recalculating. It was the moment before something changed. You think this changes anything, Victor said finally, and the question was quieter than anything he had said before, not weaker, but more real, stripped of performance, stripped of expectation. And I did not rush to answer, because this part mattered more than anything else, the weight of what came next, the direction the night would take from here. And when I spoke, I did not look at both of them, I looked at Adrian, because he was the one already standing on the edge of that change. That depends, I said, my voice steady, unshaken, on whether you were willing to let it. And that was it. The final shift, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible, because now the choice was not mine anymore. It was theirs. And as the city lights flickered against the glass behind them, reflecting a world they controlled but could not fully escape, I realized something that had not been clear before. This night was never about surviving them. It was about showing them what they had become. And for the first time, I saw it clearly in Adrian's eyes. Not fear, not anger, but something far more dangerous, the beginning of doubt. Adrian did not answer right away, and that silence felt different from the others, not tense, not controlled, but uncertain in a way that did not belong in a room like this. His eyes stayed on mine, but something behind them had shifted, like he was no longer looking at me. But through everything I'd said, measuring it against something internal, something he had not allowed himself to question before, Victor noticed it too. I could see it in the way his posture changed, subtle but precise. Like he was adjusting to a threat he could not define yet. This is not a game, Victor said quietly, and this time there was no edge. No performance, just a statement, but even that felt like an attempt to pull the moment back into something familiar, something structured, something he could control again. I did not respond to him immediately, not because I could not, but because I did not need to. The shift had already happened. Words were no longer the only thing carrying weight in the room. And when I finally spoke, my voice was softer, but not weaker, I know, I said, and that was the truth, because I had never treated this like a game, not from the moment I stepped into that elevator. Not from the moment I chose to come here at all. Adrian took a step back then, just one, but it created space. Not distance from me, but distance from the structure he had been standing inside. And that was new. That was not part of the pattern I had described. And he knew it. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, but in realization. You came here for a reason, he said. And now it was not a question anymore. It was acknowledgement. And that mattered, because acknowledgement meant he had accepted at least part of what I'd said. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. Yes, I said I did not elaborate. Not yet, because this part required patience. The truth only held power when it was revealed at the right moment. Victor exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound, controlled, but no longer indifferent. Then say it, he said, and there was something in that. Something closer to challenge than before, but also something else. Beneath it, something like readiness. And that was unexpected, because readiness meant he was no longer trying to shut it down completely. I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself in the moment, in the space I had already claimed, and I looked at both of them, not choosing one over the other this time, because this part belonged to both of them equally. I came here because someone had to break the pattern, I said, and I let the words settle. Let them exist without explanation for A. Second, long enough for them to feel the weight of it before I continued, not from the outside. I added, my voice steady, unwavering. That never works with people like you. I paused, just briefly, just enough to hold their attention exactly where I needed it, but from inside. And that was when the meaning became clear, not just the words, but the intention behind them, the reason I was standing here. The reason I had not turned around, had not hesitated, had not followed the script they expected. Adrian's eyes sharpened, not in defense, but in understanding, deeper now, more focused than before. "You think you can change us," Victor said. And this time it was not dismissive, it was direct, and I shook my head once immediately because that was not the truth, and this part mattered too. The precision of what I was saying. "No," I replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I think you can change yourselves." And that landed harder than anything else I'd said because it removed me from the center of it. It placed the responsibility back where it belonged on them. And for the first time, neither of them had a response ready, not immediate, not controlled, just silence. Real silence. And in that silence, I saw it clearly the moment the night crossed a line it could not return from, because now it was no longer about power, no longer about control, no longer about who owned the space or who dictated the rules. It was about something far more dangerous, something neither of them had been forced to confront before, choice. And as the city lights reflected in the glass behind them, fractured into pieces that shifted with every movement, I realized the truth of it fully for the first time. They had spent their entire lives deciding everything for everyone else. But no one had ever asked them to decide who they were without it until now. The word choice did not echo in the room. It settled into it, heavier than anything else that had been said. And for a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because what I had given them was not something they could reject outright. It was not an argument, not a challenge. It was a mirror. And mirrors are harder to break when you recognize what you see inside them. Adrian's gaze did not leave mine. But now there was something unmistakable behind it, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not calculation, but conflict, quiet, controlled, but real, and Victor saw it. I could tell by the way his posture tightened, not outwardly defensive, but sharper, more alert, like he was watching something shift that he had never had to manage before. "You assume we want that choice," Victor said, his voice measured. But there was a difference now, a slight pause before the words, as if he had considered not saying them at all, and that hesitation mattered more than the sentence itself. I let a breath pass before answering, not rushed, not forced, just present. "No," I said, and I held his gaze long enough to make sure he understood I meant it. "I think you have avoided it," and that landed deeper than anything else, because avoidance is not power, it is delay. And delay always comes with a cost. Adrian shifted slightly, just enough to step away from the exact line he had been standing on, not retreating, but no longer anchored in the same place. And that movement said more than any words could have, because it was not controlled, not planned, it was instinctive, and instinct reveals more than intention ever does. "What makes you think we have not already decided who we are?" Adrian asked. And his voice was quieter now, but clearer, stripped of anything unnecessary. And that made the question more dangerous, because it was real. I studied him for a second, not searching for weakness, but for honesty. And when I answered, I did not hesitate. "Because you do not agree," I said, and I let that sit between them, because this was no longer about me. It was about the space between them, the difference I had seen from the moment I walked in. The fracture that had always been there, just never acknowledged. Victor's eyes flicked toward Adrian for a fraction of a second, quick, controlled, but not invisible. And that was enough. That was confirmation. "We agree on everything that matters," Victor said, but the certainty was thinner now, stretched across something that no longer held as firmly as it once had. And Adrian did not immediately confirm it, did not echo it. And that silence was louder than anything else in the room. I took a small step back then, not retreating, but creating space, because this part did not belong to me anymore. It belonged to them. "That is not true," I said quietly, not pushing, not forcing, just stating what was already visible. "You just never had a reason to say it out loud." And that was when it shifted again, not in me, not in the room, but in them. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, and Victor's stillness became something else, something more rigid, more controlled, like he was holding something in place that wanted to move. "You are creating division where there is none," Victor said, but now it sounded less like a statement and more like a defense. And defenses only appear when something is being protected. I did not argue with him. I did not need to, because the evidence was already there in the silence and the hesitation, in the way Adrian finally looked away. Not from me, but from Victor, just for a second, just long enough to break the perfect alignment they had maintained before, and that was it, the first visible fracture, small, almost invisible, but irreversible. You asked what happens when the routine breaks. I said, my voice softer now, but no less steady. This is what happens, and neither of them interrupted, neither of them stopped me, because now they were listening, not to me, but to what was happening between them. You start to see what was always there. I continued, and I let my gaze move between them, not accusing, not pushing, just revealing. And once you see it, you cannot pretend you do not. And that was the truth that settled deepest of all, because it did not require action. It did not demand change. It simply existed, undeniable. And as the silence returned once more, no longer controlled, no longer predictable, I understood something with complete certainty. This was no longer about whether I would make it through the night. It was about whether they would be the same men when it ended. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, not in their words, not in their posture, but in the space between them, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them could stop. The fracture did not widen all at once. It deepened, quiet and steady, like something long buried finally finding air. And for the first time since I stepped into their world, neither of them tried to correct it. Neither of them tried to restore what had been lost, because something more powerful had taken its place, awareness. Adrian was the first to move again, but not toward me. Not toward Victor. He moved toward the window, slow, deliberate, as if the city below could offer him something. The room no longer could, and I watched him stand there, hands at his sides, shoulders still controlled, but no longer untouched, the reflection in the glass, splitting his image into fragments that did not quite align, and I realized that was exactly what he was feeling. Victor did not follow him, did not interrupt, but his attention shifted completely now, no longer divided between me and the situation, but fixed on his brother, sharp, focused, calculating in a way that was no longer about control of the room, but control of what was slipping beyond it. You are letting her turn this into something it is not, Victor said, his voice quieter now, but tighter, more precise, and that was the first time he addressed Adrian directly since I'd spoken. And that mattered, because it meant the center of this moment had moved. Adrian did not turn right away, did not respond immediately, and that silence was heavier than anything before it, because now it was not just tension, it was distance, the kind that does not come from space, but from difference, or maybe already was. Adrian said finally, and his voice was calm, but different, stripped of the automatic certainty that had defined it earlier, and that was the moment everything shifted again, not between me and them, but between them and each other. Victor's jaw tightened, just enough to show it had landed, just enough to show he had not expected that answer. You know exactly what we are, Victor replied. And there was something in his tone now, something closer to insistence than certainty, and that difference was everything, because insistence is what replaces certainty when it starts to break. Adrian turned in, slowly, not reacting, not defensive, just present. And when his eyes met Victor's, there was no alignment anymore, no mirrored certainty, just two perspectives, standing side by side, without blending. That is the problem, Adrian said quietly. And those words carried more weight than anything else that had been said tonight, because they did not come from me, they came from him, and that made them real in a way nothing else could be. Victor did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, that single moment where he had nothing ready to counter it, was the clear sign, yet, that the structure between them had changed. I did not step in, did not speak, because this was no longer my moment to drive. It was theirs to face, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just let the truth exist without interruption. Victor exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, but there was something under it now, something unsettled, something he could not fully contain. You are questioning everything because of one conversation, he said, and it sounded almost reasonable, almost grounded, but the weight behind it betrayed something else, something closer to concern. Adrian shook his head slightly, not dismissing him, just correcting him. No, he said, and his voice did not rise, did not harden. It simply stayed steady. I am questioning it because it was never asked before, and that was the difference. That was the line that could not be undone, because once a question exists, it cannot be erased, only ignored and ignoring. It no longer felt possible in this room. Victor's gaze shifted briefly, not away, but inward, like he was tracing the same thought, the same possibility, and for the first time, I saw it in him too. Not doubt, not fully, but awareness, the beginning of it, the edge of something he had spent his entire life avoiding. And as the silence settled again, no longer controlled, no longer predictable, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about me changing them. This was about them realizing they had never been as unchangeable as they believed, and standing there between them, no longer the outsider, no longer the target, but the catalyst. I knew the night had already done what it was meant to do, because nothing in that room would ever return to what it had been before. The room did not return to silence this time. Not completely, because something had replaced it, something quieter but heavier, like the echo of a question that refused to fade, and I could feel it in the way both of them stood, not as a unit anymore, not perfectly aligned, but separate in a way that changed everything without a single word needing to be spoken. Adrian remained by the window, the city stretching endlessly behind him, but he was no longer looking at it, not really his. Reflection in the glass was still there, but his focus had shifted inward, like he was tracing something back through years of decisions that had never been questioned, while Victor stayed where he was, centered, grounded, but no longer untouched, his attention no longer divided, but fixed entirely on Adrian now, sharp and unrelenting. "You are overthinking this," Victor said, and the words sounded familiar, almost automatic, but there was a slight delay before them, just enough to reveal they had not come as easily as they once did. And that was the first sign that even his certainty was no longer instinctive. Adrian let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not defensive, just present. And when he turned back into the room, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough that it was impossible to miss. The control was still there, the composure, the authority, but something else had been added beneath it. Something quieter, something real. "No," Adrian said, and his voice was steady, but no longer final, no. Longer absolute. "I am seeing it clearly." And that difference mattered because clarity does not need to convince. It only needs to exist. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of his brother he had not needed to account for before. "She is creating a perspective," Victor replied. And now there was something deliberate in his tone, something that suggested strategy instead of certainty. "That does not mean it is true." And that was the closest he had come to pushing back against me directly since the shift began. But I did not respond. Not yet, because this was not about me anymore. It was about what Adrian would do with that statement. And that mattered more than anything I could add. Adrian's gaze flickered toward me for just a second, not seeking confirmation, not asking for guidance, but acknowledging the presence of the question itself. And then he looked back at Victor. "It does not have to be true for everyone," he said quietly. "It just has to be true for us." And that was it. The line that could not be undone, because it separated them completely, not physically, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Victor did not speak immediately, and that pause stretched longer than any before it, because now there was no immediate answer, no clear way to restore what had been lost. Only the realization that something had shifted beyond his ability to simply correct it. I stepped back slightly then, not withdrawing, but giving the moment the space it needed, because this was no longer about influence, it was about consequence, the natural unfolding of something that had already begun. "And what exactly do you think has changed?" Victor asked finally, and his voice was quieter now, more controlled, but also more careful, like he was choosing his words not to assert dominance, but to understand the shape of what he was facing. Adrian held his gaze steady, unwavering, but no longer mirrored, no longer predictable. "Nothing," he said at first, and for a second, it almost sounded like agreement, like a return to the familiar. But then he continued, and everything shifted again, and that is the problem. And those words settled deeper than anything else had, because they did not describe change. They revealed absence, the absence of it, the absence of growth, the absence of anything that challenged what they had built. Victor's posture stilled completely. Not relaxed, not tense, just fixed, like he was holding on to something that no longer felt as solid as it once had. And for the first time, I saw it clearly in him too. Not doubt in its full form, but the edge of it, the beginning of something that could not be ignored once it had been recognized. And As the three of us stood there, no longer bound by the same structure, no longer moving within the same pattern, I understood something with complete certainty. This night had already crossed its point of no return, because the most dangerous thing that can happen to someone who controls everything is not losing that control. It is realizing they never questioned it in the first place. Victor did not respond immediately, and that silence was no longer neutral. It carried weight now, tension layered with something unfamiliar, something he could not resolve as quickly as before. His gaze stayed on Adrian, steady, unblinking, but the certainty behind it shifted, not gone, but altered, like a structure under pressure that had not collapsed yet, but was no longer untouched. Then you're saying nothing changes, Victor said finally, his voice controlled, precise, but there was a carefulness to it now, a measured tone that had not been there before. And that was the difference, because control that needs to be measured is no longer absolute. Adrian did not rush to answer, and that hesitation was deliberate, not uncertainty, but thought, real thought, the kind that takes time because it matters. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but clearer. No, he said, I'm saying we have not allowed it to, and that landed deeper than anything else, because it did not blame the system. It placed the responsibility directly on them. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, not enough to show frustration, but enough to show impact. We built this for a reason, Victor replied. And now there was something else in his tone, something closer to defense than explanation. It works, and that word lingered because it had always been enough before, always been the final justification for everything they did, but now it felt incomplete. Adrian nodded once, slow, acknowledging the truth in it without accepting it fully. Yes, he said, it works, and then he paused just long enough for the next words to matter more. But that does not mean it is enough. And that was it, the line that separated them completely, because for the first time, they were not defining success the same way. Victor exhaled slowly, controlled, but the shift in him was visible now, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the way he held himself, more rigid, more deliberate, like he was maintaining something that no longer came naturally. I remained where I was, silent, because this was no longer my conversation to lead. It was unfolding exactly as it needed to. And sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that does not interfere. Enough for what? Victor asked. And now the question carried something new. Not challenge, not dismissal, but genuine inquiry. And that was the clearest sign yet that the ground beneath him had shifted. Adrian held his gaze without hesitation. For us, he said simply, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything complex could have, because it stripped everything down to its core, to what actually mattered beyond control, beyond power, beyond the structure they had built around themselves. Victor's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, not away, but inward, like he was considering something he had never needed to consider before, and that moment, brief as it was, revealed more than any words could have. We are not like other people, Victor said, and this time it was quieter, less of a statement, more of a reminder, something he was reinforcing not just at Adrian, but to himself. Adrian did not disagree, did not correct him, but he did not accept it as the end of the conversation either. That does not mean we are above it, he replied. And that was the shift, the subtle but critical difference, not denying who they were, but questioning what that meant. And for the first time, Victor did not have immediate response. No counter, no correction, just silence, real silence. And in that silence, I saw it clearly, not just the fracture, but the space it created, the opening that had not existed before, the possibility that had been sealed off for years. And as the city lights continued to flicker behind them, reflecting a world they controlled but were no longer completely defined by, I understood something with absolute certainty. This night had already done what it was meant to do, because the most powerful shift does not happen when someone forces change. It happens when someone finally allows themselves to see that change is possible. And for the first time, both of them were standing in that realization, whether they were ready to accept it or not. No one spoke for a long moment, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed on the table, and now it was no longer about words. It was about what they would do with them. Victor stood still, but not in control the way he had been before. It was a different kind of stillness now, one that required effort, one that held something in place instead of commanding it naturally. While Adrian remained steady, but changed not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, like a door that had been opened just enough to let something irreversible through, and I could feel it, the shift in both of them. Not complete, not resolved, but real. "You believe this changes us," Victor said finally, and his voice was quieter than anything he had said before, not weak, but stripped of the certainty that had defined him earlier. And that difference mattered more than the words themselves. I did not answer right away, because this was not a question that needed a quick response. It needed truth, and truth required timing. "No," I said, my voice calm, grounded. "I believe this shows you what was already there." And that was the distinction that changed everything, because change suggests something new, something external, but recognition reveals something internal, something that cannot be ignored once it is seen. Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, like he was following that idea to its source, tracing it back through every moment that had led him here, every decision made without question, every pattern repeated without interruption, and I saw it in him. Not confusion, not hesitation, but clarity, the kind that settles quietly but completely. Victor exhaled slowly, and this time there was no control in it, no measured pacing, just a release, small but real. "And what happens after that?" he asked. And now the question was no longer guarded, no longer strategic, it was honest. And that was the clearest sign of all that the night had shifted beyond anything either of them had expected. I met his gaze without hesitation, because this answer mattered more than anything else I'd said so far. "That depends on whether you ignore it or not," I said, and I did not soften it, did not dress it up, because truth does not need protection, it only needs to be heard. And that was when Adrian moved, not dramatically, not with purpose to control, but with intention to choose. He stepped away from a window, away from the reflection that had divided him, and into the center of the room. Not beside Victor, not behind him, but separate, defined, his own position, and that single movement carried more weight than anything else that had happened tonight, because it was the first action that came from him alone, not from pattern, not from expectation, but from decision. Victor watched him, not with resistance, not with command, but with something else, something quieter, something closer to understanding, even if he was not ready to accept it fully. "You are not leaving," Victor said then. But the words were different now. Not a declaration of control, not a command, but something closer to uncertainty, as if he was testing whether the structure he had always relied on still held. And I looked at him, steady, unshaken, and for the first time since I walked into that penthouse, I saw it clearly in both of them. Not power, not dominance, but something far more human, the space between who they had been and who they might become. And I understood then, with absolute clarity, that my role in this night had never been to stay or to leave. It had been to make that space visible. And now that it was, everything else was up to them. "That is not your decision anymore," I said quietly. And the words did not challenge him. They simply existed, undeniable, and in the silence that followed. No longer controlled, no longer predictable. I knew the night had reached its final threshold. Not because something had ended, but because something had begun. Something neither of them could step away from now that they had seen it. And as the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, unchanged and unaware, I realized the truth that would stay with all of us long after this moment passed. Power can control everything around you, but it cannot protect you from what you finally understand about yourself. No one tried to reclaim the moment. Not anymore, because it no longer belonged to control, it belonged to truth. And truth does not respond to commands, it settles where it is meant to, and stays there long after everything else has moved on. Adrian stood in the center of the room now, not as part of something, but as himself, separate, defined in a way that had not existed before this night. And Victor remained where he was, but even in his stillness, there was change, not complete, not resolved, but undeniable, the kind that lingers beneath the surface and refuses to disappear, even when everything else returns to normal, if normal was even possible anymore. "So this is it," Victor said finally, and his voice carried none of the certainty it had at the beginning of the night. No authority, no command, just acknowledgement, and that alone marked the end of something that had once felt unbreakable. I did not answer right away, because this was not an ending in the way he meant. It was something else entirely, something quieter, but far more permanent. No, I said, my voice steady, grounded. This is where it starts. And the words did not rise, did not demand attention. They simply existed. And that was enough. Adrian's gaze met mine. And for the first time, there was no question in it. No search for confirmation, just understanding. The kind that comes when something inside you shifts in a place, whether you are ready for it or not. Victor looked between us. Not with suspicion, not with resistance, but with something deeper, something closer to acceptance, even if he did not fully recognize it yet. And that was the final change, not control, not dominance, but awareness shared between all three of us. I took a step back then, not retreating, not withdrawing, but creating distance, because my place in this moment had been fulfilled, and staying longer would only blur what had already become clear. Neither of them stopped me. Neither of them moved to block the space. And that was the clearest sign of all, because at the beginning of the night, that would not have been possible. The door behind me felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because everything else had. And as I reached for it, I paused, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge what had happened, what had shifted, what could no longer be undone. You do not need me to finish this, I said quietly. I did not look at one more than the other because this belonged to both of them equally. You just need to decide what you do next. And that was it, the final truth. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Adrian nodded once, not in agreement with me, but in recognition of himself. And Victor did not respond, but he did not look away either. And that was enough, because silence, when it is no longer defensive, becomes something else entirely. I opened the door then, and the quiet hum of the hallway returned, distant, unchanged, as if the world outside had continued exactly as it always had, unaware that something inside this room had shifted in a way that would ripple far beyond it. And as I stepped out, I did not look back, not because I was afraid of what I would see, but because I already knew the men inside that penthouse were no longer the same ones I'd walked in to meet, and they never would be again. And as the elevator doors closed and the city began to descend beneath me, I understood the truth that would stay with me long after this night faded into memory. He ruled the city, but for one night. They were forced to face something far more powerful than control, themselves.